What happens when a people are erased, not only from land, but from language? When maps change, names disappear, and testimony is filtered before it is heard. In Gaza, we are witnessing destruction in real time, but beyond the visible devastation, another battle is unfolding, over speech, over knowledge, over who is allowed to narrate reality.
Now I think we have to put erasure in an even more different context. We're talking about annihilation. We're talking about, the erasure of family lines and genealogies and histories and culture.
From Lisbon, Frontlines and Backrooms podcast. Your host, Vladimir Bobatik.
In modern conflicts, destruction is no longer limited to territory. It extends to institutions, to language, to memory. Universities are bombed, journalists are targeted, legal definitions migrate from policy into culture. Public discourse tightens, sometimes through law, sometimes through fear. In Gaza, the devastation is visible, but beneath it lies a quieter process, the erosion of testimony, the disciplining of speech, the narrowing of what can be said, and by whom. If violence reshapes geography, censorship reshapes reality. And when knowledge itself becomes a target, the question is no longer only what is destroyed, but what future remains possible. Professor Rebecca Gould studies that terrain, where erasure operates through institutions, language, and law. This conversation examines how power regulates knowledge and how knowledge resists. Professor Gould, welcome to Frontlines and Backrooms, and thank you for your time. In Erasing Palestine, you argue that struggle over Palestine is also a struggle over speech. For listeners new to your work, what is the core thesis of the book, and what do you mean by erasure?
Hello, and thank you for the opportunity to share my work with your readers and listeners. So my book, Erasing Palestine, has as its core thesis an exploration of the relationship between what happens in the metropole in Europe and North America as regards foreign policy and empire, and how that relates to what happens in Palestine on the ground, and how these two things have tracked each other over the past several decades, really. So free speech, I noticed when I was beginning to work on the book that it's often put, in very polarized, often it's considered only in very polarized context, and often sort of liberal European democracies. But it really, I think, is a concept that can be used to illuminate what is happening as well in Palestine itself, including in Gaza. That control over information, the control over the freedom to expose what's happening. I mean, it really applies to all of these different contexts. And so free speech is the kind of the beginning of the act of truth telling. It's the condition of without which, what has been happening in Palestine, really for over a century, but specifically for the past 3 years, the genocide in Gaza. It's a condition of letting that truth circulate, and I think Palestine is a kind of important case in the context of the various genocides and injustices happening in the world, because the pressure to silence those narratives is just so overwhelmingly strong in this particular case. And so that changes the dynamics. The price that people pay for speaking out has been quite extraordinary. And so, my book attempts to document that as a kind of a case study that I think, has broad relevance, but also is unique in many ways. So I think the map on the cover of my book kind of speaks to that. It is a work of art, kind of a sculpture / painting, a three-dimensional work of art of depicting Palestine, using mud and various materials that were that were available to Palestinian artists at a time during the Intifada, when they didn't have access to all the painting that they could have, and it shows the geography of Palestine from a Palestinian perspective, from how that country has appeared to people living there for many centuries, or really since for millennia. And in fact, Palestine is a Roman word, as far as I'm aware. It appears in Latin. And so that there's this geography of Palestine, this country, this history, this concept, this tradition that goes back millennia. But if you look at a map right now, it's been very much dismembered, and it is very much there's I think a risk that the Palestine of history is becoming kind of a figment of the imagination. It's being erased actively. It's being reassembled. I mean, similar. There are, I think, valid analogies that can be made with South Africa in terms of Bantustans and how the indigenous African population was segregated into these very discrete territories. But it does seem to be actually worse, that kind of remaking of the map of just life and geography in Palestine seems to be significantly worse right now in Palestine, even than it was in South Africa, and that's something that many South Africans have said. So I mean erasure in the literal material sense. The changing of place names, for example, during the Nakba in 1948. As Palestinians were expelled from their homes, the names of cities were changed. So like Lid became Lod. Biblical terms were sort of imposed onto them, whereas those were not the terms that had been known to the indigenous inhabitants for millennia. And it takes, so erasure is, I think that it's a productive or helpful term in the sense that it takes place at so many different levels, of the level of maps, at the level of naming, at the level of even food. I'm thinking of like hummus and all these sort of cuisines that are indigenous to Palestinians and which are being described as Israeli now. And so it's a kind of cultural appropriation where one sort of largely European tradition is imposed onto another one, and therefore the older one is erased. It's an erasure of maps, but it is also, and I my book was published in July 2023, so it should say it's a few months before the beginning of the genocide. There was a lot of violence, already. It was the worst, one of the bloodiest years in Palestinian history in terms of just people killed by Israeli soldiers, before October 2023. But I mean, now I think we have to put erasure in an even more different context. We're talking about annihilation. We're talking about the erasure of family lines and genealogies and histories and culture. I think I hope that also my book is a kind of testimony. I mean, it's about many different things, but certainly in my work since, I mean, it's also a testimony to the kind of extraordinary survival of Palestinian culture and narratives, in spite of all the attempts at erasure. So I don't wish to imply that the erasure has ever been or will ever be successful. I don't think it will, but it's obviously a very destructive and intensive process that is ultimately, it doesn't necessarily look like genocide in its early stages, but I think it at this point has become clearly a genocidal project. So yeah, that's erasure at many different levels.
We watched a war in Gaza in real time, yet at the same time, criticism of Israel seems to carry increasingly professional risk in the West. Is this climate producing self-censorship, and at what cost?
The point of my book was that pressure towards silencing, it doesn't come from nowhere, and it has very lethal consequences. That in a sense, like the more violent, I mean, I'm thinking of, in the years 2024, 2025, the more violent the Israeli destruction became, the more stigma there was to just simply naming it for what it was. And certainly that's true in like the kind of the sites of cultural life, like literary festivals, or the places where That where storytelling is supposed to kind of have a kind of healing and role. It's been very unfortunate to see sometimes it plays the opposite role. It sanitizes and normalizes violence. I think there's but the concept of erasure also shows that it's not like dehumanization doesn't always or is not limited to the work of bombs and weapons. It is a discursive process, right? It's a process that I think we could, to use very simple or language that is relatable to other people. I mean, I think we need to also think about racism in a very broad context. It's not just kind of discriminated against people based on their specific colors of their skin, but the idea of otherness, the idea that the other is somehow inferior, and that becomes a precondition, to justifying basically anything. And there is a kind of, and there has been, I think we could see certainly in the past even I would say since I wrote my book, but the context for my book is really 2017. It studies that particular period with the IHRA definition, but this idea that if you want to kind of turn people away from a horror, the first thing you do is you tell them, well, what's happening over there isn't really that important because those people aren't like us. It's not they're terrorists. I mean, that's another rhetorical strategies that's been used in the case of Palestinians, that to kind of demonize their culture, to demonize their resistance, and then once that dehumanization has taken place, which is all rhetorical, you don't even need to bring in the bombs really to set the stage for this genocide. It's taking place in the realm of ideas and kind of information warfare. Then when you have the actual material to implement a racist vision of the world, then genocide becomes that much more possible. So I think that's kind of that's another reason why we should take seriously these kinds of discursive moves. That erasure is one example.
Professor, you've introduced the term genocidal epistemicide, the destruction not only of people and institutions, but of the conditions for future knowledge. How does this concept help us understand what's happening in Gaza beyond the physical devastation?
Well, I think thank you for that. I think you're also referring to an article I published in the Third World Quarterly a few months ago. That was based on my research as well as conversations with. I have friends in Gaza too that have really given me a much deeper perspective than I would otherwise have in terms of what's happening there. So I think it's not an accident that when very early into the genocide, I think by January 2024, so around 3 or 4 months into the bombing campaign, all of Gaza's universities had been attacked. That was, I believe it's 19. So like that, they were one of the first targets, and also doctors, one of the first targets. The kind of the cultural elites were really, they were journalists as well. That I think that's one of, if we want to think about what's been happening in Gaza genocide, is that there's a very clear pattern of kind of targeting knowledge, targeting the ability to create cultural institutions that outlast the individual. That's been a clear pattern in terms of what's been happening in Gaza. And I'm actually reminded of a very insightful, I think, comment by the doctor and surgeon Hassan Abu Sita, who's from Gaza. He's based, I think, in Beirut now, but he also spent a long time in the UK. He's been very outspoken in terms of Gaza and his work there and volunteered there. He said that, he'd been in many wartime situations where the focus of the army in the attacks was to kind of destroy life in the present. They were attacking civilians and so forth. And that's obviously happening in many places. But what he felt he was seeing in Gaza was that there was also an attempt to destroy the future of the Palestinian people, targeting their libraries, their cultural institutions. And that is kind of what for him makes something a genocide, kind of about obliteration. So genocidal epistemicide, my goal with that concept was to really think about what responsibility we have as people who are not, in the field. We're not doctors. We're not we're not politicians, we're not certainly not soldiers or peace workers, or we're at a remove. We're looking at representations basically, and we're trying to educate the public. I am, and just thinking more critically about the representations they receive, and what is the role of people like that in the context of a genocide. Well, I think it's quite significant, and of universities as well. There is a responsibility for educating, the public, and kind of the epistemic dimension. So epistem is related to the word for knowledge, the Greek word for knowledge, and the idea being that genocide. I think other scholars too have written about dehumanization, kill all the brutes. That's a classic work of sort of genocide studies that talks about how language is really where genocidal violence begins, in language, and first reflects itself. And so you could see my work as a continuation in that regard, and that it's looking at how genocide aims at attacking cultural institutions specifically, and how to push back against that, how to fight that. And obviously, in the context of what we've just been saying a few minutes earlier, it's very difficult to do that when you have so much pressure to be silent, when the pressure towards censorship is so intense. It's not just a kind of straightforward, speaking your mind. It's dealing with the institutions of state that are very, very focused on silencing those perspectives. So it's a complicated balance. And I do just want to add, the context of that I say that you mentioned as well. Generally my work is about sort of representations, culture, film, literature, which I obviously think that has a lot of power to change people's perception. And I'm also interested in how people in Palestine and Gaza push back against racist representations. Just you made a comment earlier about Gaza. What did you say? Gaza is no more. And I want to push back against that a little bit in this context, because as I said, I do have friends in Gaza. I think they've gone through hell and back many, many, many times. But I think I'm also always astonished by the way they just managed to kind of to keep life flourishing there. And I just want to say that, for kind of listeners or readers, we talk in our email correspondence just this morning. I was having an email exchange with a friend in Gaza right now who's a rescue worker. Sees people dying all the time, but we were talking about novels, and he was recommending to me like a novel about a medieval castle. And so, just little things like that continue to be very much, life is very much there and present in Gaza. And I'm confident. I even know that there's an effort to rebuild a library right now. Some people are returning to university. So, they're not giving up. And I guess that's the biggest hope in terms of the struggle. They are very much, there are many people who have died. There are many, many people who are just continuing to create and live.
Let's talk about the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism. You've been critical of how it's been adopted and applied. How does it function in practice, and why do you describe it as operating like a quasi-law?
Thank you for that question. Yes, that's another major aspect of my work, and kind of a point of departure for Erasing Palestine, the book that kind of begins in 2017. It begins with the adoption of the IHRA definition, which is this International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. It's funny, they make it such a difficult to pronounce slogan, but yeah, it's been very internalized. Definition of anti-Semitism by the UK government, which was the first government in the world to adopt it. Theresa May was the prime minister then. And I think what's kind of been remarkable, as someone who's very closely followed these kind of developments in terms of how that definition has been weaponized by states, by institutions, by universities, by city councils, by all kinds of groups and organizations, is just how little pushback it's received. It is basically, for people who may not, I have a feeling people have encountered it, but they may not have encountered it necessarily like under its own name. It hasn't been formally presented to them. But I think if you're living in Europe and North America, you probably, in one way or another, it's crossed your path, whether you know it or not. So it is a definition that was put out, as mentioned, by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, the IHRA or IHRA, some people say, which essentially tries to identify what it has been called, or what it calls a new kind of anti-Semitism that is very much responsive to the state of Israel, the creation of the state of Israel, which is often aligned with people who are critical of Israel. And it is, there's like a sort of simple definition of anti-Semitism, which isn't really, just kind of redundant, doesn't really go beyond what we've known before. And then, but it's accompanied by these examples, 11 examples. Just to give one example, it's one of the examples of the 11 examples of what is anti-Semitic is denying the Jewish people the right to self-determination is seen as anti-Semitic, or calling the Zionist state racist, calling Zionism racism is seen as an example of anti-Semitism. I mean, these are very like, these are matters which one could have a debate about, but like to kind of package it all as anti-Semitic is seems to be skipping a few sort of basic conceptual steps. And I would say one other thing I think that's worth saying about this IHRA definition is that fundamentally it's based on, even though I personally, and I read about this in my book, I mean, I think that the best way of understanding anti-Semitism is as a kind of racism. I mean, and again, racism in the very broadest sense. It's not about necessarily skin color, but about otherness, the hatred of the other. That anti-Semitism is obviously like a core example of that. But this, and then so what that means, if you take that approach very, very seriously, it means that you have to be open to kind of comparison, right, with other kinds of racism, like anti-Black racism, racism against indigenous peoples, racism against Palestinians. It's an inherently comparative idea, anti-Semitism, in the way I would choose to understand it. And I think many scholars of anti-Semitism choose to understand it. But the IHRA definition can be positioned as the opposite of that. And then that's the intellectual background. But then there's also the kind of institutional and political background of this document and definition. And as I mentioned, so in 2017, the United Kingdom adopted this definition. And then many other states followed. I think, I don't know, the numbers are always contested, but many tens, possibly in the region of 100 states may have adopted it by now, or at least if the states themselves have not formally adopted it, then their institutions will have done so. Even like football clubs have adopted it. I don't know, city councils have adopted it. Universities have certainly in wide numbers adopted it, and they've been pressured to do so by their states. In the UK context, for example, the universities were threatened with withdrawal of funding if they didn't adopt it. Now, a few universities, including my own SOAS University, has not adopted it, but that's an exception. But I think when you have this happening at the level of a state, in particular, and so you have a state like kind of deciding what is and is not anti-Semitic, it's worth saying that like that goes way beyond the scope of what most of really even like the classic liberal conception of what a state should do. I mean, it's especially to do so without going through Parliament, without speaking with the public. This was done basically kind of secretly by the United Kingdom. It was just this kind of backroom deal, basically the document they signed, but purely ideological. And I find that very, very shocking. So even if I obviously do have a critique of it, but even if I agreed with it, I think that would be unacceptable. It's fundamentally undemocratic. You also have to think about what are the implications of adopting something, and not much thought had been given to that. But I will say it's proven extraordinarily effective. Like that was a very smart move by whoever wanted to promote Israel in public policy, because people are so intimidated by the idea. They think that, okay, like if a state has adopted a definition or a university has adopted a definition, it means you can't criticize it, somehow. I think that's a kind of default assumption. So it was just shocking to me to see how kind of people are ready, in my world at least, they were ready to accept these restrictions on their speech that just came from, had very little democratic legitimacy. So that's why I call it's a quasi-law, in the sense that it can't be a law in a legitimate democracy, because again, it's very ideological. It's very much about policing thought. It's very much about in censorship. There are procedures that prevent that type of definition from having legal force. And with very rare exceptions, for the most part, generally speaking, it has not become a law. there may be a few exceptions in like, very weak democracies, but generally speaking, it can't be done at this point. But it's become a quasi-law because people who get confused and they get scared and they think, okay, well, it's been adopted, so therefore I better satisfy the authorities, or else, there's some kind of campaign is going to come after me and accuse me of anti-Semitism. And then that does, if you can prove systematic discrimination in most liberal democracies, the proof of systematic discrimination, which is a little bit different from a kind of an attitude, like a practice of discriminating. In most contexts, and certainly that is illegal, and it could be prosecuted in the court. So people are there's this conflation, between like the material manifestations of racism and then this like what happens in the mind. So that's why I introduced this term quasi-law, because it's an example of an ideology, a kind of ideological document that presents itself as it takes itself very seriously, as if it were a law, when it's it's a press release. It's not that, but in some cases for people who are very susceptible to being scared, I suppose, or cowardly, really, to just be very simple about it, cowards, it is a law for them. And that's what I noticed at a kind of sociological level, that was happening in university context. I think is a perfect example. We have intellectuals who know better than to accept this law as legitimate. But universities are comprised of like intellectuals who are interested in critique, and then it's comprised of bureaucrats who are interested in preserving the institution. And those bureaucrats are perfectly ready, to pretend as if this were a law. And so I saw quite a bit of that. I mean, like whenever like a talk is forbidden to take place because it mentions genocide in Gaza, or whenever an article is rejected because it mentions genocide in Gaza, or whenever someone is fired because they've mentioned genocide in Gaza, like those are all examples of kind of treating this this non-legal prohibition, basically, on criticizing Israel, as if it were a law.
When institutions adopt a definition like this, are we crossing a line where political speech becomes informally regulated even without formal law?
I think so. I think for sure it is. And I think it builds on, I mean, I tried to put this, these developments around anti-Semitism and around the persecution of pro-Palestine speech. I tried to put it in a wider context of sort of the weakening of free speech in general, that's been going on for decades, as well. As soon as speech codes were introduced. And it's interesting that other groups, especially like conservative right-wing groups, have kind of tried to claim these same IHRA protections, like in the United States, this Hindutva, which is the movement of Indian nationalism, aligned with President Modi, have attacked scholars who are critical of Indian nationalism and have tried to pass laws criminalizing anti-Hindu speech. So it's a temple. I think there's two angles to this. So first of all, I mean, if you look at the documents, the IHRA, again, there's a long history. It didn't just happen in 2017. There was a very concerted effort for decades to create a definition that would basically criminalize and censor pro-Palestine speech, anti-Israel speech. And that really did weaponize a lot of the sort of civil rights rhetoric. It obviously only took it so far. I don't think that it necessarily can be seen as a legitimate continuation of civil rights rhetoric. I don't believe that, but it did use that infrastructure, particularly in the United States. In other words, the idea that anti-discrimination law, for example, is or the idea that you can't make certain groups uncomfortable. I mean, I think that's a parody. That's a parody of anti-discrimination law, but it's just a fact that if you look at kind of what was going on in the 1980s, 1990s among Zionist groups, they were noticing these successes, and then they incorporated that very much, and that's part of the success. I think that they effectively, or not. I mean, I think misincorporated, but the point is just that there's already a foundation that it was building on. And I see, for example, critical race theory. I'm not against critical race theory. It's an important context, I think, for understanding the IHRA definition, which is broadly sort of an attempt to kind of make visible the discrimination against minority groups in especially U.S. law and so forth. it's not, I don't take issue with many of the claims, but it just is interesting the way that Zionists were able to appropriate some of that language and take it to a different extreme, isolate isolated from other kinds of racism, but that because there was already like a kind of foundation legally for prosecuting the perception of discrimination, then it was able to get a lot more success than it otherwise would have. And so that that's the foundation. In terms of where it's going, also, yes, I think unfortunately, the ease with which many people have internalized this definition shows that, the resistance is not as strong as we would like to think. My hope is just, that in the end, common sense will prevail, because I just think this is not a document that stands up intellectually. Like, you really can't say that it's, if you want to look at what racism is, you want to look at what discrimination is, or group-based hatred, one needs to look at the thing itself. How is it directed against individuals? How do they suffer? How are they marginalized? You don't look at, estates. You don't look at these kinds of highly abstracted perceptions about, which are, really fundamentally political, about, self-determination and so forth. That's very, very abstracted. And I think, that my hope is just that common sense will prevail among many people. But it is going through a phase of repression. There's no doubt about that.
I've studied in the 90s under authoritarian government in Serbia, but even then universities were space of open disagreement. Today, many academics fear speaking about Palestine. What happens to society when self-censorship becomes normalized?
That's a huge danger, and I think it's exacerbated by material conditions at present as well. I mean, we have journalists being laid off, particularly in the United States, universities closing, funding being withdrawn. I think the institutions that used to be seen as really, I mean, in some level, one theme of this conversation is kind of a little bit about, you could say, liberal institutions. Like, to what extent do they protect free speech? I think the question of free speech, at least historically, has been understood in relationship to these institutions, because they've been seen as the bulwarks, right? But what we're seeing is these institutions are failing. I mean, either they're like literally just collapsing and going out of business, or they're aligning with the state and showing that they have no courage and no backbone. I mean, certainly, I'm a graduate of Columbia University, so I witnessed that at my own alma mater. And other universities as well have just very, readily aligned with whatever policies the government has put out to them. So I think in a sense, like, we need to put our faith elsewhere. I mean, I've lost a great deal of faith. I've lost faith in these institutions to a great extent. I haven't lost faith in the people, who made them meaningful. But I wonder if, as you're giving your example, we're kind of entering a new age where, like, these institutions, I mean, I see free speech, for me, in my writing. I mean, it's I've always understood it as being very closely related to just human freedom itself. And in it, in as much as people need to be free, there will need to be free to express themselves. So I don't think that's going to, like, disappear ever, regardless of what happens in the world. But I think the institutions that used to be seen as their protectors are just not, they're not there for that. And so we need to, there has to be new models. I mean, I guess we're in the very early stages of that reimagining of the world order. I mean, I would hope that, one thing I see happening are these alliances, these kinds of global alliances, not large, but very small scale collectives between people in, say, Palestine and Europe and the diaspora. At least, that's a positive move. I think it's become more possible to create collectives at the global level that bypass state boundaries, maybe because of technology. So there's some potential there in terms of just, like, sharing writing with the world, in terms of film, in terms of just educating the public. I mean, I think, that can be done. There can be real solidarity between communities across the world, and they don't need a university. They don't need, whatever, these things that we used to require, because otherwise it wouldn't be possible. So there's that kind of freedom. It doesn't necessarily come with economic, protections or incentives, and that's a problem. but yeah, I think, and yes, so as a self-censorship, I think when the um the institutions are clearly not interested in supporting our free speech. We just have to look to these more kind of small scale collectives and resist self-censorship in those contexts.
In your work on prison hunger strike, you describe the body as a site of resistance. When speech is restricted, how does the body itself become political language?
Sure. Yes, I'm glad you raised that aspect of my work as well. And I think it has relevance to this conversation. I mean, I was that particular monograph, which just for people, so people can know, it's available open access. No purchase required. You can download it or just Google the title. Prison hunger strikes in Palestine. Co-authored with my friend from Gaza, Malaka Muhammad Shweik. That's about prison hunger strikes in Palestine, the history of use, as you said, using the body as a site of resistance. I think I'll get to that, but first I just want to sort of tie it into what we're talking right now, because in the UK, there have been these huge, very, very significant hunger strikes that have just taken place among a group called the Filton 24. And those are very significant strikes. They have been the biggest hunger strikes in prison since the Irish strikes with Bobby Sands, where he died in the 1980s. I just think it's worth, since we're kind of focusing a lot on the UK European context, just to mention that people should also look that up and be aware of that these practices are being used in UK prisons. It's a group. It was particularly, these strikes were undertaken by, I believe, seven or eight hunger strikers who, for a period of around longer period than the Irish hunger strikers, something like 60 days, refused food, and really came very, very close to the point of death. Luckily, none of them did die. So I hope this isn't. I just think this is really, really important news that no mainstream media has reported on. They don't want people to know about this. But these protesters were sort of, the state invested all of their efforts very heavily in sending them to prison, and really treated them, denied them food, put them in horrible conditions. But when the charges against them were presented to a jury, the jury decided there was nothing to convict them on, and the state ultimately lost those cases. In the case of my monograph and hunger strikes in Palestine, that's a much longer struggle that has had many clear successes. It's led to the release. There's a kind of very systematic a practice of hunger striking that's been kind of refined over the decades among generations of prisoners who passed it on, to the next generation. Because I think something like this, latest statistics I saw is something like in the West Bank, I believe that the West Bank, Palestine, is it 1/3 of every Palestinian male either is in prison or has been to prison, an Israeli prison? And by the way, should be very clear about that. I don't mean, and they've been to prison not for things like stealing, but for things like, offending an officer. I mean, for political crimes. So the criminalization of Palestinians, especially Palestinian men, but also women, is quite extraordinary. And what that means is that, there are many people in prisons right now, Palestinians in prisons in Israel, who are not, they wouldn't fit our definition of criminal. They're citizens who are just very committed to their cause of Palestinian freedom, and who, they may have irritated an officer, or maybe they were framed and targeted. I mean, it's just the kind of cross section of people who are in prisons is very diverse, and it includes many writers as well, many great writers. And when you have that kind of a collective, I think there's the potential for the prison being a site of political mobilization is increased, right? And so there's a few Palestinian prisoners have died while striking in prison, but others have succeeded, not just in winning their own release, but in winning the release of their comrades, or in changing their prison conditions, getting more visits, getting the right. One major reason why Palestinians strike in prison is just access to education. I mean, things that shouldn't be, one shouldn't have to try to harm one's body for. But it is, I think that what unites the cases I'm talking about is just the prison is a situation in which you don't have any other weapon at disposal than your body, right? You're imprisoned, your body is demobilized, and that's all you have. And so, yeah, there are many examples in that monograph of prisoners kind of very. I do want to emphasize, like it's a very obviously it's an activity that requires a lot of physical courage and a lot of physical sacrifice, but it's also a strategy. It's something that is an education that's formed over generations. So it's both of those things.
For a long time, Palestinian testimony struggled to reach mainstream Western media. What is at stake when a people's voice is filtered, conditioned, or denied credibility?
Great questions. Yes. So I think the media is definitely a site has been a site of censorship, of even dehumanization in the context of Gaza and Palestine. I think we see that happening at different levels and in different phases. So the kind of the first phase, I noticed soon after October 7 was just like any Palestinian who got even like a few minutes to speak on the media, and regardless of their backgrounds, they would be asked to condemn the Hamas attacks. Obviously they had no information about those attacks. Even if they were not in any way consulted or, it was completely removed from who they are or what they did. It was a prerequisite to even being allowed to speak. And that in itself, it's a strategy for kind of silencing. I mean, I think it's dehumanizing, but it's something even more kind of subtle. It's about saying, like, you only have the right to speak if you speak on my own terms. Don't try to tell me what your experience is like on your own terms. Just speak in my own terms, and then I'll listen to you. So it's like this idea that the media was not willing to listen unless Palestinian voices were willing to adopt the narratives that may have been hostile or irrelevant to them. I think Edward Said has an essay called Permission to Narrate, which is still quite relevant to our times. This idea that Palestinians were not allowed to speak in their own voices because they were seen as being like potentially, I mean, that allegation of terrorism always lingers, right? And it's not tied to anything like a specific Palestinians had done. It's just by virtue of being Palestinian, by virtue of not being Israeli, by virtue of just living on their land, they were suspect. And yeah, that's certainly true. I mean, that's a good example of where kind of the media discourse, I think, is quite similar in the U.S. context and in the Palestinian context, or even the UK context as well. That silencing of voices and perspectives. I mean, just one minor example that I think comes from my own experience is when when I was at the University of Bristol in 2017, I wrote an article about when I was living in Bethlehem in the West Bank in 2011. I wrote an article about what I was seeing there. I was there for a fellowship and just doing research. It was my first time in Palestine. I lived there for a year. Anyway, it was just one of those articles that I just wrote, kind of observing what I saw. And then 5 years later, I ended up at the University of Bristol in the UK. And a student of mine, who I didn't have any very close interactions with, but he described himself as a Zionist, I think an Israeli-British student, took offense at that article simply because I described what I saw in Palestine, and it became sort of this big controversy. But the way it relates to your question is, interestingly, what the university kind of did this investigation to the article. Ultimately, I was cleared of anti-Semitism. I mean, it was all quite ridiculous, I thought. But what I think it speaks to your point about the kind of silencing of Palestinian narratives and testimonies, because the university, when they wrote up a report of my article, they erased the fact that I wrote it from Palestine. They said that it was written from the United States. So there's like complete factual misrepresentation. There's just a complete refusal to even see the geography of that I was describing. It was right there, and it was somehow deeply offensive to people that I was talking about checkpoints that were like right in front of my face. And so that was very telling, I think. I do think the situation has probably gotten better in the past Decade, I would say. I mean, there are more Palestinian voices, and they push back more heavily against mainstream media representations. But and also, yeah, there are just like these alternative sources of media. Al Jazeera perhaps is one of them. Mondo Weiss or Electronic Intifada. There are more platforms, and the technology itself allows more platforms for Palestinians to share their voices. So that I think is a way of communicating with large publics outside of what media allows. But yeah, if you stick to the mainstream news sources, they're very rigid, and this, like, the codes. I think we've seen a lot in reporting in recent years. There's these kinds of very rigid codes. But the BBC as well is another important example of where certain things just can't be said. Right? You can't say genocide. You can't even talk about the occupied territories that didn't used to be controversial. It used to be like very, very standard neutral diplomatic language. But in some media context right now, that's actually seen as kind of political or pro-Palestinian, which is ridiculous. I mean, it's the most neutral way of describing the situation, right? So in that context, actually, as regards that idea of like occupied territories in the West Bank and the annexation of the West Bank that Israel is undertaking as we speak, probably in fact it's been gotten worse. So it's definitely, yeah, there's definitely not like a easy narrative of progress, but I just do think that the technology at least has facilitated, has minimized. I mean, legacy media in general is becoming less important, right? So that's the positive side.
Professor, do you think legacy media reflect on their role in shaping the permissive environment in which this violence in Gaza and in Palestine unfolded?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, absolutely. There's still this idea that Israel is a democracy, right? That's still kind of at the basis of I think the operating principles of, and that's why they regularly interview their whatever prime ministers, Israeli politicians, Israeli IDF soldiers, and so forth. They love to kind of pontificate, right, and to demonize Palestinians. And I think they're seen. I mean, there's a sense of identification on the part of many members of the mainstream media. I'm thinking of maybe CNN, the BBC, perhaps to some extent as well, CNN, BBC, that yeah, that they are the American sort of perspective and the Israeli perspective are unified, and therefore, since the identification runs so deeply, I mean, I think that probably extends to the UK as well, unfortunately. Since the Channel 4 is a UK news outlet that's been much better than BBC, but that's BBC is very much mainstream. Since there's this close identification of the reporter with the whoever they're interviewing, the Israeli perspective, since it's seen as having these shared values of democracy and so forth, then that makes it much more difficult to recognize the perpetration of genocide. It makes it kind of beyond the scope of what could be possible. I think the assumption is like, well, they must have had a reason. If they decide to bomb Palestinians, it's because of human shields, or if they decide to destroy hospitals, because Hamas was hiding in there. I mean, I think that the way that this specter of Hamas has become a kind of all-purpose justification for war crimes, by not just by Israelis, but also by the legacy media in Europe and America. It's quite astonishing. I mean, they've been allowed to cover all crimes, and really to make things that would otherwise be unacceptable. That kind of excuse become an excuse to make the unacceptable acceptable from a legacy media perspective.
You mentioned rebuilding a library. Can poetry and cultural production preserve a future even when institutions collapse?
Absolutely. Yes, I'm glad for that question. I do believe that, and I think that certainly my Palestinian friends believe that as well. I mean, in the sense we were brought together by poetry, by our love of Mahmoud Darwish and other great poets. And that's what it's what one generation passes on to the other. I mean, even when houses have been destroyed or universities are destroyed, poetry is kind of what lives in the blood across generations. And I think there's no doubt that's what that has a power that that other kinds of institutions don't have, and it's specifically a power that there is just no way of eradicating. It's in that sense, it's like the most subversive, because it can be composed in prison, it can be composed from a camp, it can be composed in exile, and it will still resonate. And I think it's worth noting I talk about this in my article on genocidal epistemicide. I mean, the people of Palestine have an extraordinary rate of educational attainment. The literacy rate, in spite of living in very, very difficult conditions, sometimes without, like for the past 2 years, without having regular access to teachers or even writing supplies, their literacy rate is like 97%. The Israeli literacy rate is something like 92%. So it's higher than the Israeli rate, even though Israelis have much better educational infrastructure. So poetry, it's what keeps people going, even when nothing else does. And I think it connects with with it connects with not just your own life, but what a person wants to leave behind. And I think the Palestinian struggle is certainly one that's motivated not just by the self-interest of like a few specific Palestinians. It is a cross-generational struggle for freedom and dignity. And so in that sense, it very much aligns with poetry, which is almost by definition cross-generational and beyond the individual.
Professor, you lived in Palestine and have close friends there. Does it affect you personally when Palestinians are reduced to a single dehumanizing narrative or in one dimension?
Absolutely. I think probably one of the most painful moments just for me as an observer of this genocide, the kind of very specific case of dehumanization, were the attempts by the mainstream media to legitimate the starvation that Israel was imposing. I think that's a really sharp example of dehumanization in the most extreme form. Like I'm thinking of this campaign waged by certain media outlets, like the Free Press, a right-wing media outlet, but then that was picked up later by organizations like the Associated Press. CNN as well kind of incorporated some of this rhetoric, this idea that the Palestinians who were starving to death and who did ultimately die of starvation had these pre-existing conditions. They were sick already, and therefore Israel wasn't to blame. I mean, when you consider that actually the medicine that Israel refused to let in would have saved their lives. But that rhetoric was actually used, and it was actually to a certain extent, it was actually put in the mainstream. I mean, there's a difference between like the hardcore right wing and like New York Times, but the New York Times did it. They put in their captions that these starving bodies that they were showing were ill, and therefore, as if that's relevant. And I mean, I have also studied Jewish history, and I've studied the Holocaust. And one thing that and I'm not the only person to comment on this. Alex DeWall is a scholar of genocide and starvation, mass starvation, famine, forced starvation, that has also made these connections. That is coming. That's a discourse you can see very much at the time of the concentration camps and the Holocaust, and it's worth saying, that the people. I mean, most people in that, and then the scale of death is certainly different. I mean, there aren't even 6 million people in Gaza, just as how that's the number being the number that died in the Holocaust. Jews who were killed, but most of those didn't die from kind of direct bullets. They died from the same kind of siege starvation that is being imposed on Gaza. And so to see that kind of whitewashed, that there was actually, I think one of the media sources made an attempt, I believe it might have even been the New York Times, that they were reporting on the starvation of a child. And then it's sort of the Israeli ministry pushed back against it. And they showed the medical records of this kid and showed, oh, well, he was sick. And they spoke to the doctor. I mean, that's just such an irrelevant discourse. And it ignored, what was really the actual impact of the siege, which is not just about, forbidding food from entering. It's about preventing medicine, preventing baby formula. So it is very disheartening to see, essentially, I mean, to see this kind of deeply hateful, deeply dehumanizing rhetoric that, I guess I was educated to believe that was the past. It wasn't going to happen again. That level of hatred that we saw in, Nazi Germany, that was done. We moved on. So I think it has made me think a lot about this idea of progress. I mean, I was raised to believe in progress. I think many Americans were. I'm raised in the United States, and and I have to say that was not the right education. So it's but it's also instructive. I mean, I think it's good to remember in that sense. I think the Palestinians are not unique in that way. There's such a long history of dehumanization of many groups.
Are there historical parallels that help us understand today's regulation of Palestine discourse, colonial, Soviet, or otherwise?
Well, I think going back to what I was saying, in my book, I discussed the case of Abram Leon, amazing book he wrote, called The Jewish Question. And he was killed in Auschwitz, I believe in 1941. And he's someone who, so he was writing, or it was not quite at the point where, obviously he could be expected to kind of understand the trajectory of the state of Israel, but he was very worried about Zionism and what it might mean for the Jewish people, and broadly, for what it might mean for the alliance between the fight against anti-Semitism and the fight against racism and slavery. And he was thinking about decolonization, and he saw that as part of a single struggle within the framework of a kind of socialist, Trotsky socialist framework. He wrote about that very passionately, about his belief in equality, his belief that the liberation of the Jews was tied in with the liberation of enslaved peoples, and I think that's a very instructive lesson. And equally instructive is like the question of why those anti-Zionist voices from the 1940s and 1930s, many of whom were killed in Nazi concentration camps, why have they been so silent since? I mean, why have Zionists not wanted their voices to be these particular voices to be heard? Why did Leon's book not circulate more widely? It's an incredible book, a very wise, very brave. And it seems that there has been a kind of suppression of anti-Zionist voices within a census creation of the state of Israel, because it's not just Palestinians who've been seen as a threat, but anti-Zionist Jewish perspectives that have been seen as a threat. The Yiddish language, in the sense that the language of the diaspora, was very much erased as well, as part of both because of the Holocaust, but also because Israel as a state wanted to kind of create this Hebrew, like kind of fake Hebrew, right? They wanted to fabricate this new identity for themselves that was Zionist in nature. But there's a much deeper and richer Jewish tradition that doesn't really fit with that. And so I think there was a lot about Jewish history that, in a sense, and the suppression of Jewish history that is closely linked to the oppression of Palestinians. Also, the fact that if you look at how Holocaust survivors were treated immediately after the Holocaust in the 1940s, 1950s, they were very much looked down on by the state of Israel. They were seen as like weak, dirty. I mean, there's writing memoirs by survivors have written about this, about how they were not treated well, they were not respected, they were seen, they were looked down on. And I think that's very interesting because they're kind of sacralized. The Holocaust history is this exceptional event that somehow proves how much better we are than those horrible people 50 years ago. But if you look at how much effort was actually put at the time, in the immediate aftermath of the Holocaust, no one wanted to talk about it, no one wanted to remember it. It was shameful. And all of that suppression, I think, is instructive. It just shows that people, it hasn't been dealt with really in any kind of complete way. So I think, if you obviously, like, mainstream Jewish history has been weaponized in many different ways, but if you take a critical lens on these aspects of Jewish history, I think it helps put the Palestinian struggle in context as well, and shows that they aren't opposed to each other.
Professor, at the end, if erasure operates through institutions and language, what does it take to break that frame?
I guess two things. First of all, I think we can't, at the risk of being sentimental or not sentimental, but just kind of individualized. I mean, I think people do need to be courageous, and they need to be willing to think long term, not just about like their short term promotion possibilities or whatever, but think about the longer term. Like what legacy do they want to be left with? And they need to be willing to ignore the voices that ask them to not speak out. And often, I think there are enough case studies in terms of people who have resisted the pressure to censure and have prevailed that I think we can draw inspiration from those. But also there needs to be a collective in which they can share their voices and perspectives. So going back to our conversation about like creating solidarities across borders, I think that, now that we know that, say, like mainstream newspapers like the New York Times or Washington Post are not going to be venues that are going to support these free speech about Palestine, it's possible to form new collectives, and some of them are being formed. So I think that it takes supporting each other and supporting particularly voices from Palestine, and letting Palestinians, not just letting Palestinians speak, but letting because they are speaking, in a sense, they're writing their stories as without us or not, but also being guided by these voices and perspectives, and listening in a way that's accountable. And I think the potential, the audience for that type of writing and thinking, I think, has definitely grown. That's the students, who were suspended and punished, and they were radicalized. I mean, they were made aware of the stakes of speaking out in ways that maybe other groups have forgotten. So so I think that's to an extent courage, but sometimes often that's not enough. It needs also to have an audience.
Professor Gould, for me, time flew. I really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you for your time and for talking to Frontlines and Backrooms.
It was a great pleasure. Thank you so much. I enjoyed it.
Over the past conversation, we've looked at this conflict from different angles, through law, through institutional language, through the politics of knowledge. What emerged is not a single argument, but a pattern, a system in which legality, vocabulary, and memory interacts. Violence is never only physical, it is also administrative, linguistic, epistemic. And if erasure operates across those layers, then understanding it requires patience and attention to structure. This series is not about headlines, it is about the architecture behind them. The full archive is available in the description. Thank you for listening to Frontlines and Backrooms. And until next week, keep looking beyond the noise.